So like I said, when you came in, first off, like massive thank you. I was literally expecting this to be like my dad, my dog, my wife, and kind of no one else. But the uptake's been incredible. You know, as you can see, loads of people are joining, and it's really nice that you're kind of interested in what I've got to say. So the topic of the talk, as you well know, is kind of about how to hit the ball further. But within that, we're going to cover a little bit more as well. We're also going to cover some general principles around strength and conditioning for golf, which I'm hoping you'll find really useful. While we're talking, we've also got the chat function enabled. So if anybody wants to comment in the chat at all, then you're more than welcome to do so. So feel free to use that, please. And we can get started. I will make some time for questions at the end as well. I should just add, and oh, actually, sorry, I should have posted this at the start, but in the chat, you'll see I'm just posting a link, a Mentimeter link. Now, when you follow that Mentimeter link that's in the chat, you'll see an option to essentially open question, and then within that you can post a question. So if any questions come up through the course of the chat, feel free to just sort of type them in. Try and word them as best you can so they kind of make sense to me and I can answer them the best that I can. You'll also see when you go to ask a question that you can thumbs up other people's questions. So if you see a question that you particularly like, give it a thumbs up, because I might, depending on how many come through, I might not have time to answer all of them. So I can then prioritize the ones that have kind of been I'm a qualified physiotherapist as well. I also like to think of myself as an applied sports scientist because whilst I work as a strength and conditioning coach and physiotherapist, I absolutely help people with things that are outside of just injuries and training. You know, we help them with sleep, we help them with travel, we help them with workload monitoring and scheduling, and all sorts of other things as well. So applied sports scientist just basically means I help in all those additional ways. And I've got a PhD in sports exercise medicine as well. Actually, whilst it's sports and exercise medicine, most of that was research in golf, and particularly around like distance in golf, and a lot of research around kind of youth athletes. And since the PhD, I've continued to do research in other areas, and I've got all sorts of stuff on the go at the moment with the European Tour, with the Ladies European Tour, with England Golf, and actually outside of golf with football and other things too. And then in terms of the organizations that I work with, for those of you who don't know, so I work with the European Tour. So I'm the head of strength and conditioning on the European Tour. And I started that service pretty much from scratch a few years ago with loads of help from ETPI and the physios and doctors that had kind of already become established as a medical service. So, you know, they had a great medical service running. The players wanted more strength and conditioning support. And I stepped in with some colleagues, Will Wayland, who many of you might know, Simon Brearley as well, and a guy called Nick Jones. And we set up that kind of European Tour strength and conditioning service. And then I also work with England Golf, where I'm the sports science and medicine lead. So within that, I deliver to our national boys, girls, women's and men's programs, but I also help oversee our strength and conditioning through the regional pathway, which is working with, you know, kind of a couple of hundred, 150 or so girls and boys under 16 and under 18. And we have 10 strength and conditioning coaches working across England to support those players. I also do private consultancy work. So I work with players one-to-one a lot. So, you know, if there is anyone on this call who at the end wants to get in touch, you're welcome to message me either through social media, or if you go onto my website, you can find my email and send me a message as well if you want any help. And then also I've recently started a business with a few friends, Jack Wells, who you might know, who's published a fair bit in golf, and Simon Brearley as well, who works with me on the European Tour and in England Golf. And we've started the Golf Performance Network, which is due to launch in the next couple of weeks. And essentially it's around sort of education of evidence-based practice, and it's kind of it's about the impact or teaching people how to use evidence-based practice, strength and conditioning, and applied sports science approaches to golf. And it's essentially a course and a network of support over a period of time. So that'll be launching over the next couple of weeks too. So that's kind of a bit about me. Here are just some images of stuff I get up to. So, you know, on the European Tour with England Golf, with all sorts of different players that we work with. Just getting lifting weights and having fun in the gym and pretending it's work, basically. But yeah, just to give you a kind of flavor for what I do. You'll kind of immediately notice here that there's lots of weights and there isn't much like movement assessment and screening and flexibility stuff. And there's kind of a good reason for that. And whilst we kind of do broadly help people with flexibility, range of movement and stuff, I do think it's overemphasized in golf, and we take a much more traditional core strength and conditioning approach to working with golfers, much like the approach people might take in other sports as well. And also we apply a lot of strength and conditioning principles, science, sort of robust testing procedures. We use force plates and all that kind of stuff. So our systems and setups are a little bit different to your kind of traditional golf fitness type stuff where there's lots of screenings and movement focus. So yeah, we take a slightly different approach to it. And then I suppose going into today's plan, my plan is to sort of go for around about an hour. So we'll probably finish around 8 o'clock, my time anyway. And that'll include hopefully some time for questions as well. And over the course of this talk and the questions, essentially I want to cover, you know, like why you should train for golf, first and foremost. Although if you're on this call, I assume you might already be a little bit bought into that, but we'll try and explain why we think it's important. I'm going to talk a little bit about why and how to get bigger for golf, why and how to get stronger for golf, why and how to get faster for golf as well. And then at the end, I'm going to touch a little bit on who and trying to make sure that you get quality support, because whilst out of this presentation, you might be able to take enough information to be able to apply some of this into your own practice. I'm also very conscious, that people might want to seek additional support, and I'll try and give you some tips and some ideas around how to look for the best person for you. You know, if that's not me and it's someone else, then that's great. These tips will be very broad and just about like how to find good support, which I think is really, really important for players at the moment. So just to start off with a little bit of a disclaimer, I've said everything I'm about to say is at least a little bit wrong. And that's absolutely true. Like when you're summarizing an entire profession of strength and conditioning and applied sports science into a condensed lecture and trying to sort of simplify the message in a clear enough way that you can leave with something that's actionable, that means there's always going to be a little bit of generalization and there's going to be a little bit of glossing over some of the details. So I'm hoping that this presentation kind of helps you and means that you can leave with a clearer idea of why and how to do different things to maximize distance and to train better. But just be aware that, you know, like I say, everything is at least a little bit wrong because it's not individual to you, and it's kind of there's some generalizations in there as well. So we'll start off with why train for golf, and this is something that I've thought about very deeply over the last few years, and many of my colleagues on the European Tour, England Golf, have as well. And I know when I first got into golf, I actually got into golf as a physiotherapist. And I realized quite quickly that in golf, when they employed a physiotherapist, they actually meant a strength and conditioning coach. So I was employed as a physio, and I was fortunate enough to realize that I didn't know enough about strength and conditioning. And I was being asked to do something that perhaps I didn't know enough about. So I started doing lots of research. which included some golf specific stuff and some very non-golf specific stuff. I surrounded myself with lots of different coaches in different sports to find out what they did. And I upskilled and essentially became a strength and conditioning coach. My PhD was in strength and conditioning as well. And I noticed at the beginning of getting involved, there was a big emphasis on trying to impact a player's technical ability. So improve your technique in your golf swing, or, you know, somehow translate it into kind of golf technical work. And I was very frustrated at the fact that actually I didn't feel like I was able to achieve what players were expecting me to achieve. You know, I was working with some very good players and I was trying to help them move better in their swing, and it just wasn't happening very easily. But everything I read and everything I looked at seemed to claim that there was this great link that could be sort of tapped into, and that the strength and conditioning would impact the technique really easily. And I didn't experience this, basically. And over a period of time, me and my colleagues on the European Tour and at England Golf have looked at the literature around, you know, sports and exercise medicine, sports and exercise science, both for golf and outside of golf. And one thing that became very clear was that there is a huge amount of research supporting the impacts of exercise training, strength and conditioning, physical preparation on your availability and readiness to practice and perform. So basically, and I'll get into some details in a second, staying injury free, being able to play and practice a lot, tolerate the demands of that practice, etc. Across sport, we noticed there was a moderate amount of research to show that you could make some decent gains in clubhead speed and hit the ball further if you train well. And there was a broad lack of research, high quality research, demonstrating a transfer to technical ability. So the ability for me to give someone an exercise that makes them swing a golf club better. And when you think of things from a coaching perspective as well, and you think how difficult it is to make a technical change in your golf swing through coaching, when you have a pure focus on that technical change, it's not surprising that exercise perhaps doesn't translate quite so easily as people claim. And so essentially the research started to mirror my experiences, which were, I was confident that by training people and all the rest of it, we were improving their availability and readiness. I was fairly confident that pretty much anyone that came through the door, I could kind of help hit the ball a little further. And I was less confident that I could improve a player's technique. Because especially the players that I'm working with, like, they're very, very, very good. So making any change in their technique is incredibly difficult. You know, as a coach, as the coaches on the call will know, let alone as someone who's not a coach. So then, just to kind of build on that story a little bit more, when we talk about availability and readiness to train, the reason I think this is very important for golf, and actually this is contrary to what some of the media say, and it's what some of the commentators say and things, is that some research has shown that we get up to 6 times our body weight in compressive force through our spine, and 1.6 times shear body weight shear force, which like shear side to side, almost like through the different areas of the back. And some other research has shown that there's about 7,500 newtons, and this was a pros in 1990. It's going to be more now. With you guys coming through, the guys who are in the call. So 7,500 newtons compressive force through the spine, and there was 596 newtons of shear force through the spine, which is again that kind of side-to-side type force, and 750 newtons or 7,500 newtons, sorry, is about 750 kilos of force. So a lot of weight. If you think of lifting 750 kilos, it wouldn't come off the ground. And 596, about 59, about 60 kilos of body weight in this kind of shear force. And to put that into perspective, a lineman going into a blocking sled when they're doing their tackle training will have about 8,679 newtons of force going through, so about 870 kilos, something like that. And disc prolapses in cadavers, so when people just look at studies with bodies rather than actual real people, 5,448 newtons is enough to cause disc prolapses, so it's a significant amount of force through the spine. And 570 newtons is enough to cause pars defects, and this like of the shear force So pars defects happen a lot in young golfers and also cricketers, fast bowlers and things. It's basically like a stress fracture in the spine. And some people on this call might have had that. It's very common in golf, and especially in young golfers who get back pain. So there's enough force in a golf swing to cause a stress fracture, and there's enough force in the golf swing to cause lots of other things as well. And there's enough force in the golf swing to be almost comparable to a lineman going into a tackle. So it's not surprising that back injuries are the most common injuries in golf, but also it's sensible to think that getting stronger and improving your ability to absorb those forces is going to reduce your injury risk. And the research really strongly supports that. So despite, again, what commentators say and what some people say, you reduce your injury risk by about 50% in overuse injuries when you regularly resistance train. And about 80% of golf injuries are related to overuse, overload, workload management type issues. So you're halving the risk of 80% of your injury risk by doing strength training. So that's why the main reason why we think it's really important, because hitting the ball an extra couple of miles an hour might help you perform a better or get a better score today, but actually not missing a tournament with an injury. Well, that tournament might be the tournament that you were just about to win, and you'll never know. So it's kind of an intangible, but it's really important. We'll also, when we talk about availability and readiness, being fitter, stronger, more athletic, it improves your ability to tolerate training. So you can train more frequently, you can train for longer periods of time, you can kind of bounce back from that training really effectively. You can handle the kind of lifestyle and schedule of being a pro athlete much better. So people who are fitter and healthier and who are stronger are more likely to be able to deal with jet lag. They're going to be able to deal with those kind of travel demands. They're going to be able to, again, just deal with that kind of general lifestyle of being a tour pro a bit better. You're going to stay healthy and bounce back more quickly. So you're less likely to get sick. You're less likely to have the sickness as long or as severely. You'll bounce back to full health a little bit quicker. You'll also do the same around injury. So you're less likely to get injured and you'll bounce back from those injuries quicker as well. So it helps with that just general health and bounce back ability, which is really important. You'll potentially move better in the swing in a more kind of healthy way. So whilst it might not necessarily massively change your technique, you're just going to be able to absorb and deal with forces better. And also, whilst it won't directly necessarily change the swing all of the time, it will make you potentially more coachable for the coach. Maybe they can achieve a few more things with you if you're ironing out some of those issues you might have. And the other thing, it gives you more potential for all of those reasons. It gives you more potential to have a longer and more successful career. So that means that you can kind of play from 2 to 102 and you can enjoy golf your entire life. It also means that you can be successful as a 20-year-old pro. You can be successful as a 60-year-old senior tour player. So you know, golf is one of the few sports that you can have a really long professional career, and training and staying fit and strong will help that career last longer and more successfully. Then getting into, again, a bit more on the why and around the club head speed, I guess, which is what this talk was sort of labeled for. Research clearly shows and experience clearly shows that you can have a lower handicap because you can shoot better scores on par 4s and 5s typically, but it obviously affects the game more broadly than that as well. And tour pros earn more money. And this is illustrated really nicely by the image on the right-hand side here. So this is data from the European Tour through the 2019 season. And you can basically see that the guys who average between 270 to 280 yards earn 127 and a bit thousand euros, which isn't terrible, but the guys who averaged 310 to 320 yards earn over €1 million. So the evidence is pretty clear. Like, this is a really nice monetary example. If you increase your driving distance average, remember, again, I've had lots of conversations with players and they say, oh, I can hit it 300 yards when I'm maxing out. But this is the average for the season. So when you can average a season at 310 yards versus 370 yards, you're basically going to win a load more money, which is really, really important, obviously. And to kind of give us some goals around that, 3 to 4 miles, and many of you will know this obviously, but 3 to 4 miles an hour in club head speed is probably worth about 10 and a bit yards. And that is enough to change your club selection in your second shot. So I always think like a 3 to 4 mile an hour improvement is a minimum improvement in club speed for it to have a real world impact on your game. And obviously more is great. And 3 to 4 miles an hour is something that you can achieve in quite a short time span of the right kind of training as well. And you can certainly make some real seismic shifts over a number of years. I've worked with players who have layered on sort of 3 or 4 miles an hour per year for multiple years, and that starts to add up after a while. So that's our club speed why. Basically win more money, shoot better scores. Our transfer to technical ability kind of issue, I suppose, or thing to discuss. Now, I've said that it's difficult, and I'm not saying it's impossible, but I think it's just worth noting at this time, it's really complex, it's very individual, and it's very, very hard to achieve, which is why it goes at the top of our pyramid. It's in the pyramid because it's possible, like it could happen. It's just much less likely to happen. If a player comes in and says to me, I want to be healthy, like I can guarantee, well, not guarantee it, but I can guarantee it will have an impact. If you say I want to hit the ball further, I'm pretty confident I can help you do that. If you say I want to improve my technique, unlike many people, I'll say I might be able to help, I'll give it a try, but no promises. And you'll find this is an area you just need to be quite cautious around, because lots of people are selling snake oil here and kind of trying to persuade people that it's quite easy or that they can definitely do it. It's quite hard, and it's not always going to happen. So next we're going to move over to the whys and hows of bigger, stronger and faster. And I think just to sort of start, before going into the details, bigger, stronger and faster don't have to be done in that order, but it's not a bad order to do things. And the reason for that is if you're a relative beginner in the gym, you need to develop some technical competence. You need to get good at doing the exercises, and bigger often requires a little bit more volume, and you can sort of go through the exercises and the movements a little bit more. You don't always lift quite as much weight, certainly as a beginner, if you're doing slightly higher reps, and we'll caveat that in a second, but you're doing slightly higher reps. So it's a really good place to start. Lay on a bit of mass, develop some strength, get really strong so you can produce high forces, and then learn to access that very quickly. Now, again, that's a broad generalization. There are other ways to do things, and it very much depends on the individual. But broadly speaking, I've done bigger, stronger, then faster, because it's, if you're going to follow a formula, that's probably a good formula to start with. So why bigger? And I think, obviously this has got a lot of attention recently with Bryson and with, particularly Bryson actually. But there is a reason that getting bigger can help, or there are a few reasons. One is that larger muscles, larger sort of cross-sectional area of muscles, the bigger muscles produce bigger forces, essentially, in general. It's not 100% true. It's not like a straight correlation one between the other, but in general, bigger muscles produce more force, and more force is good. And we'll talk about why when we get into strength. The next thing is more of you helps you absorb more force, and therefore it can reduce your injury risk. So, the example I replied to someone on Instagram when I was advertising this was that, would you rather crash an old Mini or would you rather crash a 4x4? Clearly the 4x4 has more stuff to absorb the force of the crash. You'd feel safer in the 4x4. And it's the same in a golf swing. If you're big, you've got big muscles, you can absorb and dissipate the force. Your injury risk is likely to drop down. The other thing is the change in the center of mass, because obviously if you're bigger, then your center of mass changes, effectively changes the relationship of the lever to the club head, which can increase angular momentum, and ultimately it means that you get a slightly faster swing. And then the last thing is being heavier can help ground you to the floor, so it essentially helps with stability. So as an extreme, if you've seen like young kids swinging golf clubs and the golf club kind of throws them all around, all over the place, you'd imagine if they're heavier, they're kind of anchored to the floor, literally like an anchor being thrown off the edge of a boat in the middle of a storm. It kind of pins them down when they're getting blown around. It kind of holds them more in one place. The weight can kind of help pin you down to the floor. That could also help with people who struggle with stability in their swing or whatever, and it can help with kind of awkward lies and that sort of thing. So just grounding can be a good reason to get bigger as well. And there's a lot of sort of discussion around, does bigger have a negative impact on your flexibility and your movement in your golf swing? And I'd say, like, I haven't met many golfers who are big enough for the size to impact their golf swing. Like it doesn't really happen. You have to be pretty massive for it to cause a big problem. So we're not talking about those sorts of massive changes, and it happens progressive, like gradually over time. You don't just wake up one day and you're 10 kilos heavier. So it's something that you can kind of build up to over time. Your swing will adapt as you build the mass, and everything is typically all good. So in terms of how, again, so these are general recommendations. They're quite broad. There's lots of ways of applying them. There's lots of ways of kind of putting this together, and there are some caveats to this. But if you want to put in en masse, in general, do more compound lifting. So squats, deadlifts, bench presses, overhead presses, those kinds of things are going to be really helpful for developing mass. I wouldn't do what most people do, which is kind of your bro split type stuff. Bro splits basically is if you've taken your mass building program from Men's Health, it'll tell you to do, like, I don't know, a bicep and a chest day and a back and a triceps day or something, and maybe a leg day, and you kind of do all that sort of thing. That's not generally a good way of doing it. And the reason is you aren't just trying to put on mass in a stupid way. You're trying to be efficient with your time, and you're trying to develop other qualities, like secondary and tertiary qualities, that are going to help you for golf. So you don't just want to get big. You also, and we're not necessarily talking massive here, but we're not just trying to improve the size of the muscles. We're also trying to encourage them to produce more force, which means we need heavier weights. And we might be looking at some velocity stuff as well. We want you to move fast. So generally compound lifts, heavy lifts, better ways of doing that than lots of bicep curls and things like that. So yeah, I would just kind of bear that in mind. Now, I think, sorry, Tim's just put his hand up. I'm just bear with me 1 second, because I think on the security kind of, here we go. There you go, Tim, you should be able to unmute yourself if you want to ask a question. Oh, no, I think he's gone. Okay, cool. So we're generally going to look for compound lifts. We want to produce high amounts of force, and that's one of the reasons why. So that means that you're going to be doing like upper lower splits, upper lower 4 days a week, or maybe you'll do whole body 3 days a week. So that would be, here we go. So 1 sec. Yeah, so sorry, just to stop. So I've got a couple of comments that I'll just reply to before we move on. So Rob said, would you generally lean towards squat, hinge, push, pull, carry, brace? Pretty much. So I'd say, first off, as a golfer, your primary focus is on your sport, not on the gym. So you actually want a minimum effective dose. Like, you'd rather train 3 days a week than 6 days a week, or you'd rather train 4 days a week than 6 days a week. So generally you've got whole body sessions, which will be like squat, hinge, push, pull, carry, brace is one way of doing that. There are some slightly different ones. I tend to say bilateral force exercise or explosive exercise rather than say squat, because that could be like deadlifts, leg press, rack pull, a hex bar deadlift, anything like that. And then you've got explosive loaded exercises that could go into that category as well. Then you might go a push, like a bench press, an overhead press, pull up, a row as your pulls, your hinges, RDLs, barbell hip thrust, that kind of thing. Carry is like a trunk type exercise. You could do loaded carries, but you can also do other kind of trunk work. I tend to be a little bit more specific with trunk work. Actually, I think of it in a more detailed way than just general bracing. We tend to look at like flexion, anti-flexion, extension, anti-extension, rotation, anti-rotation, and kind of try and break the trunk down into different functions that we can work on. Sam sort of mentioned about our bro splits not better for overall volume. Now they are, and I'm going to get into the caveats in a second. But there are some very specific reasons why we don't just want to, well, actually, sorry, I'm going to stop there. They aren't necessarily better. High volume and lower volume work can have similar hypertrophic benefits. So if you do low volume, relatively low volume, I mean, like if you did 5x5 or you did 6x3 or something like that, that could be as good for hypertrophy as doing 4x12 or 3x12. But the 6x3 or the 5x5 is going to increase your strength more. And since we're training not just for mass, but also for strength, then actually distributing our work in more of like a whole body or push-pull kind of way is going to achieve the same hypertrophy as bro splits and high volume, but it's also going to have a better impact on our force production, which is really important. Sorry, I'm just reading a couple of the questions that are picked through while we're here. Cool. I will save those questions actually and kind of come back to things. So for the people who didn't have their questions answered, feel free to chuck them on the Menti and I'll kind of get back to that, because otherwise we might end up sitting here for a little while answering sort of a range of different things. So feel free to kind of keep populating. I'll just jump on and then we'll kind of come back to some of this stuff. But hopefully that's kind of giving you an idea. Compounds, 5 to 8, 4 sets. You can use high reps on certain exercises that aren't your compounds. You generally want long rest periods. People traditionally use 30 seconds in a minute. There's kind of an argument around how that affect or that improving hypertrophy because of like metabolic type reasons. But essentially it doesn't make a difference. Well, it does make a difference. 3 to 5 is better. The longer rest means the higher weight lifted and has an overall better effect. We kind of mentioned 3 to 5 times a week. Generally 3 to 4 is actually good if you can get away with it, 5 if you need it, and work relatively hard, pretty much. So don't go light on yourself. Now the caveats are, and this kind of links into the question around bro splits a second ago, is we need to consider the secondary and tertiary effects, or like all the other effects of the decision that we make. So if our goal is to get bigger, stronger, and faster, then if you can get bigger by doing bro splits at 3 sets of 20 reps, and you can get equally big by doing 6 sets of 3 reps, but you're going to get stronger doing 6 sets of 3 reps than you are by doing, like, whatever I said, 3 sets of 30 reps, then you're going to do the 6 sets of 3 reps, because you're going to get the same hypertrophy response, but you're also going to get the benefit of increased strength, significantly increased strength, much more than you would with 30 reps. So we need to think of the kind of caveats around both what I just said a second ago in terms of 5 to 8 reps. Actually, we might do 3 reps. You might do 6 sets of 3 reps because it's more leaning towards what we want. So lower reps, more sets, even longer recovery times, all of that kind of stuff is going to help us get the most in terms of those secondary and tertiary impact, or dealing with those secondary and tertiary impacts. And I think this is especially true in the upper limb. So with the upper limb in golf, it needs to move incredibly quickly, whereas the lower limb needs to move like relatively quickly, but not like as quick. It's fairly isometric, high force. You've got a fair bit of time to express that force relative to, say, other sports, or certainly to the upper limb in golf. So definitely the upper limb work needs to be potentially lower reps, higher velocities, or higher loads and velocities. Whereas the lower limb, you can probably get away with some of the higher rep stuff, but still lower reps are often going to be better. And this is particularly for more like the experienced lifter. So if you're inexperienced and you're trying to develop technique while doing hypertrophy, maybe you're up in the 8s. Actually, if you're very experienced and you're really advanced as a lifter, then you might be doing like doubles with really long rests, you know, like 5, 6, 7 minutes and then going back, you know. So there are kind of caveats to this sort of stuff, and thinking about those other effects. So there are a bunch of different questions coming through the chat. I'd just encourage, if you can you dump them on the Mentimeter, just because then other people can kind of vote them up, just in case there are quite a lot to get through. But if they're on here as well, then I'll kind of bounce between both. So just moving over to stronger. So why do we want to get stronger? Well, we want to be able to produce larger amounts of force, and we need to be able to produce that force, you know, relatively quickly. And when we're talking about strength, I tend to think of it as like, if we're a car in a drag race, then you've got two things that you can really be good at: your 0 to 60 time and your top speed. If you think of strength as your top speed, and you think of speed, which we'll go into in a second, as your 0 to 60 time, if you have a 0 to 60 time, or 0 to 100 kilometers or whatever, 0 to 60 mile an hour time of 3 seconds, but your car's top speed is 80 miles an hour, you are not going to win the race. You need a top speed that is good enough to win the race. You need a 200 miles an hour, you need 300 miles an hour, whatever it is. And that's your strength. It's the amount that you can kind of move into to a point. So getting stronger kind of gives you an amount of force that you can use, and then doing the speed work will help you access that force quickly. So force production will help with having room to go into fast and being able to do it quickly and speed things up, essentially. The other thing that's really important is being able to slow things down. So you need to be able to essentially like decelerate, don't you? Because when you go into the top of your backswing, for example, you decelerate the club and then you kind of move it the other way again. So getting strong helps you slow things down, and being able to slow things down effectively can be protective against injury as well. So I think that's a really key one to consider. And that's why we do like a relatively decent amount of like eccentric work, isometric work. It's not all concentric. It's not all moving something up or forward fast or heavy. Holding things and controlling things in the opposite direction, like slowly lowering a weight, can be equally important depending on the context. And then the next thing is, strength is really one of the key drivers for that injury risk reduction from the resistance training. So the bigger muscles dissipate the force, and the strength again kind of helps absorb and deal with that force. So getting stronger, again, despite what some of the media say and what some people say, will help reduce your injury risk. Now, in terms of how to get stronger, again, these are some broad recommendations, and we can obviously, they can be personalized and dealt with in different ways. But again, we generally want compound lifts. We generally want 2 to 5 reps, 3 or more sets, 3 or 4 sets, long rests of 3 to 5 minutes. Most people don't rest long enough. Like if we want to lift a heavy weight, which is really important for us getting stronger, those long rests are key, because it means that you can essentially lift more. Or if you're not trying to lift more weight, but you're trying to lift like the relatively heavy weight faster, it will also help with that. You should pick exercises that you're kind of comfortable with or can execute effectively. So, you know, if we're looking at someone who's really, really tall, let's say you're 6'5", 6'7", something like that, me giving you a deadlift off the floor probably isn't the best way of you doing strength training, because you're going to find that really uncomfortable. But actually, if I raise the deadlift, if I raise the bar up off the floor, use some blocks or something, or if I get you into a trap bar and raise it up, you might find that's a lot more comfortable. You're much more comfortable loading it up, and you're kind of happy to put on that weight, basically. So picking exercises that suit you are more important than the type of exercise. So going back to that kind of, do you do squat, hinge, push, pull, carry, brace? It's like, I would say bilateral, as in like 2-legged force exercise rather than squat, because I don't really care generally, like broad statement, but I generally don't care if you do a trap bar deadlift, a standard deadlift, a snatch grip deadlift, a leg press, a half squat, a quarter squat, a rack pull. Like they're all just 2-legged heavy force exercises, but you might be able to execute some much better than others. So picking the ones that fit you best is really kind of important. The next thing you need to do is lift with intent. So basically put a lot of effort in. Try and move it as fast as you can. Even if it's moving slow, it needs to move as fast as you can move it. That's very important. We're looking for sort of 2 to 4 times per week of training. And again, you just need to work pretty hard. So then, and again, there are kind of caveats and things around this. There are some little nuances and details, but generally applying that would be pretty good. Again, using kind of whole body and upper lower splits as the way to go. So then getting faster, basically the reason to get faster in the gym is to get faster in the swing and hit bombs. So the strength work has lots of additional benefits. The hypertrophy work has lots of additional benefits. And don't get me wrong, the speed work still causes a lot of adaptations that are beneficial to, say, injury risk reduction and other things. But the main goal of doing that over strength training or over hypertrophy work is to hit the ball further. And like I said earlier, the top speed is important, having the ability to produce enough force as well as being able to produce the force quickly. So it's not just good enough to do nothing but speed work to hit the ball further. You have to do hypertrophy and strength work to hit the ball further, as well as speed work. And depending on where people are in their journey, and this can be some of the challenges of programming for people, it might depend on like the ratio of those different things. So we might have, I would never just do speed work, for example. You might have a bit of strength work, a bit of speed work in different amounts to try and get the best overall response, as opposed to just sort of silo into one or the other. So yeah, so when we bring in the fast stuff, essentially what we're looking at is jumping, loaded explosive work, and throwing stuff. So jumping can be body weight jumping. With golf, we're looking at more of like a ballistic type exercise than a plyometric. So you don't need to do landing and rebounding a lot really quickly with short ground contact times. You can just focus on more ballistic work, which is where, for example, jump up in the air, land, wait for a bit, jump up in the air, land, wait for a bit. If you're working with a sprinter, or if you are a sprinter, very important that you can have short ground contact times and sort of get off the ground again and again as quick as possible. If you're a golfer, you don't do any of that. So the jumping can just be high as you can, land, wait, high as you can, land, wait. The loaded explosive work. So some people will do trap bar jumps. Some people will do squat jumps, so with a bar on your back jumping. Some people will have like a goblet squat position and they'll jump. That they're all fine. Some people will clean, some people will snatch, some people will do derivatives of those, so like hang cleans or rack, or yeah, all sorts of different derivatives. I think again, largely speaking, and this is a broad statement because there are differences between those exercises, but it doesn't matter too much. Like if you're really comfortable with Olympic lifting and you want to do those weightlifting movements, then go for it. If you've never learned and you don't know how to do it, or you don't want to learn, then don't bother. Like just jump with some weight, it's fine. On the European tour, we obviously work in a truck. And when you're in a truck, like you can't do cleans and snatches with a load of players around you, and you certainly can't drop the weight. So we just get them to jump with some weight and it's fine. Like, so don't feel you have to learn a specific exercise for this, but a loaded explosive exercise is key. And then throwing stuff is good. So like throwing medicine balls and things like that, for example. Now, with the throwing stuff, you need to think of what you want to achieve, which is basically you want your upper limbs, your arms and stuff to move really, really, really fast because they need to move fast for the golf swing. So pick exercises that help you do that. If you're trying to make a very golf specific type, almost like a golf swing with a medicine ball, it's probably not as effective as just slamming a ball into the floor, throwing it over your head as high as you can, almost like punching it into a wall. So try and pick exercises that help you express your explosiveness as well as possible. They don't have to look similar to the golf swing. They have to produce the adaptation that you want from the golf swing. Okay. And again, in terms of like guidelines, 2 to 5 reps, 3+ sets, 3 to 5 minutes rest, kind of pretty similar to strength and hypertrophy, just drop some of the volume a little bit. There are some caveats to this. Again, there are different ways of doing things. Again, with explosive work, there are lots of different complicated ways of putting exercises together and packaging them. But, you know, if you just want a simple recipe type approach, then this will kind of get you started. Again, pick exercises that suit you. It kind of fits what I was saying with the med balls there. Like, you want exercises that allow you to express your force, lift with intent. So you're trying to move fast. It means you kind of need to try and move fast. Like, you can't just jump. You have to jump and try and get your head through the ceiling. Your intent, your effort is really, really important with these things. They're not heavy, but they need to be incredibly explosive. And again, you want to train probably 2 to 4 times a week. Again, hopefully those guidelines help. So then the next thing to think about is kind of the golf specific speed training. Sorry, let's grab a drink. So I think sometimes there's an assumption that if you lift in the gym, it's just going to magically help you hit the ball further. So you've got bigger, you've got stronger, you've done some explosive work, you turn up to the range and suddenly you're hitting it 20 yards further. And that does happen sometimes. It certainly happens more with people who are less well trained, or who haven't lifted much before, or aren't that strong, or whatever it might be. But it doesn't always happen, and there can be lots of reasons why it doesn't happen. One, you can get more explosive, stronger, bigger in the gym, but maybe your technique isn't very good for swinging fast. So maybe you need to make some changes. Maybe you need to work with your coach and say, I'm working with someone in the gym, or I'm doing this program. I know I've got stronger. I know I've got more explosive, and here's the data to support that, but I'm not swinging it further. Can you help me? And if your coach knows that one of your goals is to swing the club faster, they can guide you and help you achieve that. And I actually think that that's more important than things like speed sticks and max effort shots and stuff like that. Like, start with the low hanging fruit. The low hanging fruit of training is everything I'm talking about here. Lift heavy stuff, get a bit bigger, get a bit stronger, and then lift that stuff quickly. Like, that's the low hanging fruit. When you're good at that, we can get really complicated with training, and we can really try and squeeze as much out of you as we possibly can. But the basics are to do the basics well, and that will give you the best rate of return. And working on your technique for distance with your coach is probably the most sensible and most effective way of gaining distance. You know, maybe it's you just grip the club a little bit further up and it increases the length of the lever. I'm not saying do this stuff, you know, you guys work on your technique with the appropriate people, but just as an example, like, that would maybe make a difference. Or maybe it's going into your backswing faster. That might make a difference. But some of those changes might make 2 or 3 miles an hour difference straight away. And I regularly see good coaches give a couple of pointers to a player and the speed goes up. So start with the basics before you start thrashing speed sticks and things like that. Make sure that you've got the basics down. After you've got those basics down, or alongside those basics, the other thing to do is to actually make sure that you schedule time in your week to hit the ball as hard as you can. Because again, most of the time you speak to a player and you'll say, what's your speed? And they'll hit the ball and their speed's maybe 112 or something, club head speed. And then you say, right, now hit it as fast as you can. And they go up to 115. And you think, well, immediately there's 3 miles an hour there that's missing from your golf swing that you've already got. And that's not to say that you have to play at 115, like maybe you play at 112. Maybe you go to 115 and you realize the ball goes just as straight and you've got just as much control over it, and you were maybe scared of it, but actually it's fine. In which case you can now play with 115, 3 miles an hour, no effort. The other thing you might do is, okay, let's say you're not comfortable playing at 315 or 115, but you train at 115, that 115 becomes a 116, that 116 becomes a 117. Well, now your 112 has become a 113, your 113 has become a 114, and suddenly your playable club speed has been brought up with your max club speed. The whole thing, the ceiling is raised, and now what your max used to be is now your comfortable swing. And then finally, you just get comfortable doing it, and maybe you start to hone that technique and develop the confidence in taking that to the golf course. So I'd recommend maybe like 2 or 3 times a week. Again, discuss with coaches and things, but you can work out a bit of a plan. 2 or 3 times a week, you can practice hitting the ball hard as you can, and you can kind of develop that. Then I guess on top of that, after that, or alongside that, you can use more sort of specialist methods, which, you know, there's kind of pros and cons, and it's kind of a whole area to talk about. And I'm not going to delve into a lot of detail, but I think needless to say, it's kind of something that needs some thought, and it's something that isn't the low-hanging fruit. It's not necessarily the place to start, which isn't to say it won't be effective, but it's not necessarily the place to start. And when you're looking at the physiological adaptations, the things that happen to your body as a result of hitting a ball as fast as you can versus swinging a speed stick, for example, as fast as you can, the physiological differences between those two tasks is well, they're so comparable that there isn't going to be a huge difference in like the adaptation of your body to those two tasks. So hitting a ball as hard as you can, swinging a speed stick as fast as you can, are largely going to have the same sort of result. Difference is when you're actually hitting a ball, you're getting other feedback as well, like developing confidence, striking the ball, developing the kind of ability and confidence to play with the shot, tinkering and tweaking with your technique in ways that allow you to add an extra mile or 2 an hour here and there. And so that net gain can sometimes be greater than just the adaptation from the physiology. So it's a good reason to kind of incorporate that into your plan. So if you're doing your gym training, and potentially you'd kind of bolster it along that technical development and that kind of max speed development as well. Okay, so the next thing is, I guess just kind of, I've alluded to this all the way through, but putting this together is really difficult. Like I've obviously studied this stuff for years. You know, my PhD was part-time. It took me like 7 years to do because it was part-time alongside all the other stuff. I've been working in golf for best part of 10 years with England and European tour for like 5 or 6 years, and then I've obviously worked before that as well with other things, and I still feel like I'm getting to grips with how to work with different players that sort of come in front of me in different situations. And the guys I work with on the tour would say the same thing. They are only now, after these many years of experience, starting to even like grasp really exactly how to approach these sorts of problems. And the whole thing's always up in the air. We're always questioning it, we're always researching it, and so these kind of broad generalizations might help you get started, absolutely. But I just know that this isn't everything, and there is a lot more in putting the whole piece together. You know, and I've given this kind of analogy in the slide here. It's like you've got a recipe. I'm sure many of you have done this. I've certainly done it a number of times. Get a recipe, you try and cook the thing with the recipe, it's rubbish. You know, I give it to my wife, she tells me it's rubbish, and then it gets thrown away and we do something else. Like quite often, just like with cooking, strength and conditioning recipes don't always work, and it might get you started, it might be good enough. Maybe you put the recipe together and it works for you, but just know that it is difficult, and there are lots of other factors that feed into it. Try not to underestimate the difficulty of getting it right. But at the same time, I very much hope that this sort of presentation has helped take you a few steps closer to understanding this topic. I'm sure many of you understand quite a lot, having been interested enough to sign up, but I do think it helped. I do hope it helped, rather. Next, we're going to, or finally, rather, we're going to get into a bit around who. And I guess I could do an entire session on who not to get help from. There are a lot of people out there in the industry. It's not specific to golf. It's true of many, many sports, but there are a lot of golfers out there, which means there is a lot of money to be made, which means that people market to golfers regularly, and not all of them are good. And it's not always the person that shouts the loudest that is the best person for the job. So these are just kind of some bits to look for. The first thing is look for broad qualifications and experience, not just golf. So have they worked in other sports? Have they worked with other athletes? Those things might help you make those kind of decisions. Whether you're a coach or whether you're a player on this talk, you might As a coach, you're quite often the person who guides the player to the right person in the team, and you want to help the player make the right decision. Or if you're a player, you need to make sure that decision is right for you. So have they got experience in other sports? What other sports they worked with? Do they work with other coaches from other sports? What are their qualifications? Don't just look at like TPI. TPI is, not to fully poo-poo it here, but like it's essentially like a weekend course, and becoming a strength and conditioning coach who's experienced with a broad range of experience across sports and a deep understanding of how physiology and training science is a really serious endeavor. So things like TPI can help you understand golf a bit better, but that isn't the benchmark for strength and conditioning. When we employ on the European Tour and when we employ with England Golf, we look for recognized national bodies for strength and conditioning, not for golf. And that's UKSCA in the UK, so UK Strength and Conditioning Association. It's the NSCA, CSCS kind of certification, US and worldwide, or the ASCA, which is an Australian one, or, those kind of relevant big bodies. So if you're a player or if you're a coach and you're looking for somebody, look for those kind of broad qualifications to show that they are a strength and conditioning coach. Ask questions and fact check them, give them a bit of an interview, make sure that you kind of understand what they're doing, do your research, fact check what they're saying. Avoid people who are too movement, screening and flexibility heavy. I haven't got into it in great depth today, so you'll have to take my word from it to a point or not. But essentially, the research around movement screening isn't very good in terms of transfer to technical ability or in terms of injury risk reduction. And it's largely, it's not to say it's not useful, but it's not the kind of core of the program and the core of the approach. So make sure that the underpinning rationale, things that I've discussed, kind of fit into that programming approach, which isn't to say movement assessments and screening are bad. Like, by no means, there's a place for them, very context dependent place, but there's a place for them. But just make sure there isn't an overemphasis there. And then the same with flexibility. Like, unless your flexibility is stopping you doing something very specific in your golf swing, you don't necessarily need to become more flexible. Like, lots of people think they need more flexible hamstrings, but like, how are your hamstrings really affecting your golf swing? It's kind of very rare that happens. So, and flexibility doesn't reduce your risk of injury at all, either. So, overemphasis on flexibility can kind of be a bit of a problem. And the final thing to say, and this is probably very much true for the pros in the room, because I know that there are a lot of pros who have jumped in here from European Tour and also high-level amateurs from England Golf and stuff like that. Like, just because they work with a big name doesn't mean they're any good. And I'm sure the tour players who are sitting here and the pros who are sitting here will vouch for that. There are some great people who work with very good trainers, very good players, but there are also some terrible people who work with very good players. So don't just look at the name. Make sure that you're kind of checking the levels, the standards, the qualifications, the knowledge, because ultimately that's what matters. Okay, so then just, I guess, final piece to wrap up is just, get in touch if you need any more help. From my perspective, like, I can help with physical profiling and testing, training and programs, injury management, general applied sports science, all that kind of stuff. So if anyone does feel they need a bit more, then please feel free to get in touch. Now, that's the presentation finished. If you just bear with me for a moment, I'm just going to find some of the questions. I'll just stop the screen share. I'm just going to find some of the questions and see where we are with the Mentimeter. Okay, cool. So we have some questions here. I'm conscious some stuff's gone on to the normal chat as well, but I'll work through here first. Okay, so the first question was, hi Dan, would you even move towards explosive 1 rep max lifts? Now, I think there's a place for singles. It's not something that I use very commonly. I think that the the kind of risk is perhaps a little bit higher if you've got someone who isn't experienced. I would definitely use like doubles and triples. Not usually at an RP 10, not like max out doubles and triples very often. Usually it's within themselves a little bit, doubles and triples. Again, bearing in mind, we generally want to develop strength, but with a bit of kind of intent, sometimes a bit of velocity, depending on what we're doing. So yeah, I rarely use 1 rep maxes or those sorts of lifts, but I definitely use doubles and triples a little bit. And also sometimes I use singles for other things like GPP type stuff, like general preparatory type work, when you're getting people fit and they haven't trained for a little while, doing like lots of doubles. So one, like one squat, one press up, one squat, one press up for 5 minutes or something, just to get some fitness up. Or you might use some like cluster type training and that kind of thing. But yeah, not a huge amount at 1 rep max. So then the next one was, with speed training, how long should you spend per session hitting balls as fast as you can? It's a really good question. So I think, like, for me, the advice I give, so there's no research on this really. So the prescriptions are kind of from experience, and they're in that regard a little bit arbitrary, but I kind of apply the same principles that I would from a strength and conditioning standpoint, because throwing med balls, swinging golf clubs, I kind of think they must be pretty similar. And I'd normally say to aim for somewhere between 15 and 25 reps in total. I normally get people doing them anywhere between 2 and 5 reps. So you might do 2 swings, rest, 2 swings, rest, or 5 rest, 5 rest, with a couple of minutes between each rest period. So you're taking a substantial rest to keep your rest to keep your speed up. If you do have access to a launch monitor, I'd also watch for velocity drop-offs. So if your club speed starts to plummet, then cut the session. But I'd normally put sort of 25 as a max, and maybe 2 or 3 times a week. And it's probably like not a bad idea to do it on the same day as you're lifting if you can, because then if you're doing 3 days of lifting, 3 days of speed work, you actually get to use the other days as proper recovery, because you put them into the same session. Orders can vary depending. How important would you say cardio is? So will running help get faster? So pretty much no. So cardio largely doesn't matter for golf outside of the bottom of the pyramid, which was, availability and readiness to train. You need to be fit and healthy enough to not get sick, not get ill, and all that stuff. But the demand is so low from a cardio perspective, I wouldn't do it for those reasons. So where are kilogram body weight thresholds? Okay, so we've got, so this is an interesting question, which is, are there kilogram body weight thresholds that you typically work towards? So something like, should you be squatting 2 times your body weight, for example? And I'd say, like, you can have these things in the back of your mind, but it's a very individualized thing. I've worked with, we actually use isometric mid-thigh pull force a lot, which is like a force plate isometric type strength measurement. It's better than 1 rep maxes because you don't need good technique. So it works really well for players, whether they lift a lot or don't. If they're brand new, you can still do the same test. And I've brought players up considerably in their strength. I mean, strong players, but just made strong players super strong in some cases, like golf context appropriate, obviously super strong in golf. And we haven't seen improvements in club speed, and other players we have. So there certainly seems to be a very individual point at which the rate of return stops. So getting any stronger doesn't help, but that's individual. And I would say that's something you find with experience, essentially by getting that strong and seeing that you're not benefiting anymore. So generally no, although obviously, like, you can throw the usual ones on that are used for multi-sport type athletes. So 1.5 to 2 times body weight back squat is a nice number. Around 1.75 to 2.25 deadlift is quite a nice number, etc. And then if you're working with female golfers, you'd normally knock about 25. I'd normally knock about 20-25% off that, and it usually sort of fits as the right kind of number. But it's not something I kind of rigidly apply. So I hope that helps. Okay, so we've got the cardio one that came up again. If you want to put on muscle, should you always eat a calorie surplus, or should you try and stay lean as well? I'm going to sort of give you a bit of a, I'm not going to give you a straight answer for that. It kind of depends on what you want to achieve. Like if you're wanting to put on size, then that's different to if you're wanting to like do a bit of recomposition, basically. So if you had someone who was very heavy, maybe even a little bit overweight, they might want to sort of recomposition or go through a recomposition almost, where they're adding a bit of muscle, losing a bit of fat, trying to balance that, or stay the same weight but just train more because they're happy with their weight. If you're working with other people, they might want to actually increase the kilos in their body, and the answers will be different for those two. So it depends on your goal. Okay, so what is your opinion on using the extended rest periods to take advantage of low-level exercises that don't impact central nervous system so much? So basically, when you lift heavy, you've got to sit around for, let's say, 4 or 5 minutes. Would you do some other exercises in that time? And yeah, absolutely, you can throw in some like supplementary type exercises. I think that's good use of time. It's really good if you're working with someone who gets a bit bored and twitchy and is likely to cut their rest period. So if you're someone who just can't stand sitting around for 4 or 5 minutes, then absolutely put things in the rest periods that don't affect, that aren't sort of heavy lifts and don't affect your general fatigue, and also aren't kind of in the same muscle areas. So if you did some back squats, you might do some like upper body, like banded pull aparts or something. It's good use of time, definitely. Have you found a point where increased body mass leads to a decrease in rate of force development, or is the time taken for golf swing not short enough for this to be an issue? That's a really good question, and it's something that me and Simon, actually one of the guys, he might be on the call still, who I work with on the European Tour, talk about quite a lot. And I certainly think that for the upper limb, there's kind of a higher specificity or sort of higher demand for high velocity, and in the lower limb there's less of a demand for high velocity. So the relative contribution of being big and strong is higher in the lower limb than it is in the upper limb, which means the impact is probably less, or the rate of or the point at which you no longer get return is probably much higher. From an anecdotal perspective, I haven't seen that as a kind of direct thing, but I've certainly seen lots of people who just get really gym strong but don't really do anything that helps transfer to the swing. You know, like getting really strong is going to help to a point, but if you're just like back squatting and deadlifting loads of weight, but you've never done anything fast and explosive, and you're just doing high reps all the time, you can get really big and strong and it doesn't transfer to the golf swing anymore, like beyond a certain point. I've certainly seen that, but it's hard to say as to whether that's because they've increased their mass too much, or whether it's just because they're not training very well. How much of Bryson's transformation can be put down to him being relatively new to strength and hypertrophy training? Good question. I've got no idea, because I've never obviously worked with him. I've never met him either, but it's a really good point, which is that if you're new to resistance training, you're likely to benefit from almost anything that you do really quickly. So it's good to take advantage of those newbie gains. Would you have separate sessions for strength, faster, and bulk? Not necessarily, but maybe. So for example, if we're working on the European Tour, we're in a tournament, and we're like training on Tuesday, Wednesday, Saturday, or let's say Monday, because compete Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So Monday, you're at home, you might do your high volume, high load strength training, hypertrophy training on Monday. Wednesday, you might just do a low volume strength session because it's not too fatiguing if you manage it correctly. And then on the Saturday, you might do an explosive focus session. And that's because it's going to be sort of slightly lower fatigue, maybe affect your tournament a bit less and stuff. That's kind of again a broad generalization. So there might be emphasis across the week like that. However, I would say that almost always there is something of everything in everything. It's just about the relative distribution. So if you think of it as like a pie chart, the percentages kind of switch. So maybe on a Wednesday or Thursday at a tournament, someone's doing some heavy lifting, a little bit of explosive work as well. Well, the heavy lifting is going to help with the hypertrophy as well as the strength. And then the explosive work's obviously going to help with the speed. But then the emphasis between, say, the Thursday or Wednesday or Thursday session and the Saturday or Friday or Saturday session, there might be a higher explosive emphasis Friday, Saturday, and there might be a higher strength emphasis on the Wednesday or Thursday, even though they've both got both, if you know what I mean. As a recreational golfer, what equipment do you think would be best for me to buy to train at home, as I don't have a gym membership? So in terms of like orders, and this is not like financial or space, this is just all, all things open. Basically, in this rough order, barbell and weights, that's kind of number one. Number two would be a squat rack, preferably with pull-up bar, but like, if you couldn't, just the support stands would be fine. Then probably like a decent set of dumbbells, then maybe a hex bar or trap bar, then maybe a slam ball. And I'd kind of work through in that order as priority. Right. When would you suggest targeting your diet should take place in terms of increasing protein intake? So diet is something we haven't covered today. I'm not a nutritionist, although I obviously read up a fair bit and know a reasonable amount about nutrition, but I would basically say it's always a priority. It's just another piece of the puzzle. You wouldn't necessarily work on your gym instead of working with a psychologist or instead of working with the golf coach. And I'd say, considering your nutrition is just a piece of the puzzle. It's not as an instead of, or when you're ready for it. It's like, it's something that you always want to think about. And having a good protein intake is important for recovery. It's important to prevent things like muscle loss, especially through a season. People lose weight a lot of the time through seasons. And it's also good for making advancements in the gym. So whilst it's helpful for the gym, it's not just for the gym, it's for kind of other things as well. So always think about it. If overweight, would reducing body fat be beneficial in addition to getting stronger, or is there little compounding effect? So assuming you're overweight and healthy, then actually like mass is generally good for the reasons that we described. So mass to increase force production is only really lean mass, but mass to dissipate forces and help with injuries, and mass to change center of mass and the lever effect, and mass for stability through the ground and anchoring effects are all one and the same. Like heavy is heavy and heavy is fine. There are some potential downsides, largely around health, if it's kind of a health thing. But if you just if that's not a problem, then mass isn't bad, as long as it's not interfering with anything else. So you could just try and get stronger if you wanted to. Should you avoid lifting on a day where you're playing, or should you do some part of, should you avoid lifting on a day when you're playing, or should you do some as part of warm-ups? You should definitely lift at tournaments if you can, but only if you've tried it out before. Like, you shouldn't try new stuff at tournaments. But we definitely get people lifting at tournaments on the tour all the time. And if you think about it, the season for the following year starts in the previous November. So pretty much players don't have an off season. They're off competing every single week all the time. There isn't a nice 6-month block or 3-month block that amateurs might get. So they lift in tournaments, or we encourage them to lift in tournaments, because if they didn't lift in tournaments, they wouldn't lift, in which case they just wouldn't be able to do any of this. But there are some very specific ways to approach lifting in tournaments. Largely speaking, if I just go with some broad generalizations, you want to have you want to have lower volume. So most people say, oh, it's a tournament, I'm not going to lift as much weight, but because I'm not going to lift as much weight, I'm going to do more reps. So suddenly they drop their weight a bit, but they do a bunch more reps. That's more likely to make them sore because they're not used to the exercise, and more reps isn't necessarily good for soreness, as anyone can attest to who's done high volume training. So actually it's better to keep the same weight or the same intensity of work and drop the volume. And that's usually what we do. So they're all the questions on Mentimeter. So I'm just going to close that down now. I'm conscious we've gone over time, but people are still hanging around. So I will just have a look and see what we've got. So the thresholds one, I think, was asked around kilogram body weight. So just curious, would there not be a greater emphasis on core workouts and motions with repetitions due to the rotation element and the amount of golf swings per round? So yeah, trunk work is important. Trunk work is important primarily for two reasons. One is transferring the force from the lower limbs to the upper limbs. And then the second is probably injury risk reduction, which means that most of the trunk work we do is anti stuff, like isometric holding against certain movements. So stopping you rotating against a weight, stopping you leaning to the side against a weight. So anti-side flexion, anti-rotation, anti-extension, things where you're having to hold positions against a force, because that's going to help with your ability to control, absorb, and tolerate the forces of the golf swing. So absolutely important for that. And it's also helpful at transmitting the force from the legs to the arms, because the trunk doesn't generate the explosiveness, the force, it just transmits it. So we do lots of isometric stuff as well as general core or trunk strengthening work. We tend not to do lots of high repetition rotational work. You get so much of that in golf that generally speaking, you don't need much extra. You know, if you're doing hundreds or thousands of swings per week, then best we probably don't continue to do loads of that. Wait, so do you have consideration for programming with players for, say, more power focused days, explosive in gym context coupled with specific day type of training? Okay, so it's like, do you have an explosive, from what I gather, do you have an explosive focus day and then like a specific focus day? This is probably like going into a whole nother talk, so I'll try and keep it brief, but it depends what you mean by specific. Because for me, I would say being explosive is specific because it's making you fast. I would separate the idea of specific looking like golf, and instead I'd think about specific being the quality that you want to develop. Now, if the quality you want to develop is speed, then speed is specific, because it's going to transfer to your swing. Looking like a golf swing, but moving slowly with a band isn't specific because it's not going to essentially allow you to move fast. So for me, the specificity is largely dictated by the physiological adaptation that we want to achieve. Someone said, what types of exercise would you recommend for a person with diastasis recti? Oh, sorry, that's sort of jumped away. There we go. Got it back. So I think it depends, really. I think I would generally treat people sort of fairly similarly, but find things that were sort of tolerable and working pretty well. So I wouldn't necessarily avoid anything in particular, and I wouldn't necessarily overemphasize anything in particular. I think it's probably a very individualized case, but I definitely get people working on those kind of compound lifts still. I definitely get people working on sort of similar type trunk work and just developing the same kind of physical qualities that we want. But it kind of fits the same comments that I made earlier around like just general strength development. It's trying to find exercises that suit the individual. And actually that's often the biggest piece of the puzzle and the biggest difficulty of working with people is trying to find the exercises that suit their needs the best. So yeah, I don't think there's a set rule that I would apply. I think it'd just be working with the individual. So Sam said, I got qualified through TPI and can vouch for what you've said. I actually nearly left after day one because I felt they were too screening heavy and sold on injury and fear factor a lot. Yeah, I kind of don't like the overemphasis on movement assessments, and I don't think it's well supported by the research either. I certainly haven't seen many papers that kind of support it. Hi, Dan. Are there any of the compound lifts that would be any better or worse for women? Is there a major difference in training for men and women? So that's a really good question. I guess well, it's not in short. There isn't very much research on women in golf, very, very little. And I think it's very disappointing, actually, and something that we're trying to work on at the moment. So we're just about to start doing a load. So if there are any ladies European Tour players here, we're going to hopefully be starting to do some research with you over the next, well, certainly over the next year, but for long term as well. And I'm working with some women's health specific researchers and women's performance researchers to do that as well. So hopefully we'll be able to publish more stuff specifically around women's preparation for golf, training for golf, health for golf, performance for golf, around a whole range of different topics. But in general, I would say the same lift should work the same for the same sorts of adaptations. And I think it's just, again, working with the individual in front of you. You might prefer a certain lift over another lift for lots of different reasons, but broadly speaking, getting stronger, getting more explosive, getting larger muscles will be able to help for all of the above reasons. Everything I've said today should be broadly applicable to women and men equally. Although having said that, I think generally there's a larger performance advantage for women gaining strength and mass and the like, because the amount of uptake in that area isn't necessarily always as high at the professional levels. And from what I understand, there are a lot of women who train on, say, tour, on LET or LPGA, but not all of them are training as well as they could in terms of strength, compound lifts, heavy lifting type stuff, which means that there's a bigger gap between the weak and the strong. So potentially there's a huge area to explore there, I think, for some women. Again, I'm giving kind of broad generalizations, but I think there's a lot to be gained. And we've certainly seen that with the England players, like getting the England women training hard, they start to separate themselves from the other people quite quickly in the squad, and they start to hit the ball further quite often, not always, but quite often. So we certainly see those kind of separations, and we see quite big differences between the strongest and the weakest women's players in the squad. I'd say larger differences than we see in the men's squads in terms of best to worst. So there's a bigger gap to kind of move up through. So I think there's potentially a really big performance advantage to that. I've got lots of messages, so I'm just going to give it 5 more minutes and see how many I get through, because I'm conscious we've still got 75 people here. So I'll try and go through another 5, and then at kind of 1:30 or so I'll wrap up, because more are coming in. I think there's still 22 that are there. So would you say using resistance bands are useful? If so, are they most useful for, and what exercise do you recommend? So resistance bands are, I guess that's a fairly big question, but resistance bands are really useful when you don't have weights. But ultimately, if you want to lift heavy things to get stronger or bigger, or you need to lift weights really fast, they're not as good. So barbells, trap bars, dumbbells, slam balls, all those things are better. And going back to that gym question, what would you have in the gym? Those things come first. Bands are good for when you are traveling and you don't have access to that stuff. Bands might be good for warm-up. Bands might be good to sort of go in with other exercises. Bands might be good for home workouts. So they have a place. I generally focus less on the tools and more on the adaptation that you want, and then the best way to get that adaptation. So if you think about the guidance I gave, can you achieve that guidance with the bands? If you can, then you can make it work. And if you can't, then it might not work as well for you. At what point would you start looking at diet to put on weight? I think we've kind of answered that question. That probably came up earlier. Thank you for Sam. So thank you, Sam, if you're still there. So I got a question, just ask it, someone saying they're in the middle of the PGA course, they weigh 100 kilos, fairly strong, but struggles with turning through impact and at speed. Is there a specific exercise? So there isn't necessarily a specific exercise that would definitely fix it. It's kind of worth thinking about what's restricting you. It could be that your hips are restricting you, for example. And if your hips are restricting you, like going into internal rotation in your lead leg, then there could be 2 reasons for that. There could be more than 2, but mainly 2. One could be a flexibility issue, but one could be just an anatomical issue. People have different shaped hips. Different shaped hip means that some people can turn and they're fine. Some people can turn and they get a bit of a block because there's a different shape to the hip. It doesn't move around as much. And that can cause restrictions in a lot of people as well. So what I'll try and do in that case is try some mobility work in your hip, see if it makes a difference. If it doesn't make a difference or it causes pain, maybe it's an anatomical thing and you can't make the progress that you want to make, and then you change your technique accordingly. But of course, it might not just be hip. There's lots of areas that could be causing that kind of thing. I'd say in general, kind of explore some options yourself. And if you're not finding the solution, it might be worth seeing someone to get help. So views on supersets to minimize long rest periods. I use supersets all the time. I think they're a really good way of being efficient with your training. Ultimately, you want it to impede on your life as little as possible. So if you pair exercises together, then you can be a little bit quicker, a bit more efficient. That's great, especially in tournaments and things as well. So yeah, someone asking for the recording. So yeah, I'm going to try and sort out recording. I have recorded it, so I'll figure that out over the next few days. Okay, so there was a question about, I'm not sure if they're there anymore, but because someone said that they missed a bit, but there was a question on potentiation. So potentiation is the idea of doing something fast or heavy before you hit shots might help you distance. And I think there's two things with potentiation, and there's also priming. Potentiation is about improving your muscle recruitment, basically, so you can be more explosive. So if you do heavy lifts or jumps and then you swing club, it might go faster, kind of like how a warm-up works. The other thing you've got is priming. Priming is the idea that if I train in the morning, it has hormonal changes that mean I'm more alert and more likely to perform better in the afternoon. I'd say both are systems that work from like I'm assuming we're talking about transferring to play perspective. I think priming is most useful in many ways because that basically means train in the morning. You might compete well in the afternoon, but also by training in the morning, you've got a training session in which keeps you fit and strong. So I think that's a good thing to do. Potentiation is less often used because we're looking at something that impacts you pretty much straight away. And since people aren't often going to sort of jump or lift something heavy and then wait for 7 minutes before they hit their shot, it doesn't have to be 7, but you know what I mean? Like that's used less often. But in theory, if you're on a par 5 and you wanted to bomb it, if you did 2 or 3 counter movement jumps as high as you can, waited for a couple of minutes and then gave it a go, you might find that you nudge the club speed up a little bit. So potentiation can be used in that way. We also use potentiation for training sessions sometimes, which fits into those supersets, lifting and then jumping high, for example. Oh, speed. Yeah. I think I might have answered this from Marek, but I think it's just picking up on something that maybe I got, or they're just picking up on something I got earlier, but it was around speed sessions on the same day as a power day in the gym. And yeah, I think there's no massive problem with that. Just prioritize the most important thing at the time you're most likely to perform best. So if you perform best in the afternoon, do the explosive strength session in the afternoon. If you perform better in the morning, do the explosive strength session in the morning, if that's priority, and vice versa for the speed work. Like whatever's priority should go first. Just lots of thank yous. So thank you, everybody. So I had a quick question, which is the last question. I'm going to answer 2 last questions. One's on movement screening, because that was the next one up. And then the last one's on like younger people training, because I think it's a really good question. So the first one was, there seems to be a boost in tour players doing cycling. Oh no, sorry, that was the wrong, I've lost it. Here we go. When you say movement screening is not supported by the research, can you please give specific examples of literature to read on this? Thanks. So the first thing I would say with that is there isn't very much research on movement screening for golf. So the first point is that there isn't very much research. There's not many like examples of golf specific research that shows it works or not, because it's just kind of not there. Whereas other methods, or in general, again, that broad generalization, I'm sure you can find some stuff. Whereas other things like improving health and reducing injury risk and hitting the ball further, extensively researched both within golf and outside of golf in the broad strength and conditioning literature. And that's something I'd encourage when we look at research. Don't just look at golf research, but also look broad. What does the science show in other sports? What does the science show from an underpinning physiology perspective? I think in terms of the movement screening in general, most of the movement screening research has been done on things like FMS. I don't have the sort of citations to the top of my head, but if you search FMS and performance or FMS and injury, and find some systematic reviews or meta-analysis through Google Scholar, you'll be able to find these kind of broad reviews that look at these topics and find that it generally doesn't predict or reduce the risk of injury, again, generally, and it generally doesn't predict or sort of work as an indicator to performance. But there are lots of caveats to that, and there are lots of things that you might screen for, which are very specific to certain injuries that players get. So, for example, we're developing you could call it a screen. It's not like a movement screen, but we're developing a screen at the moment where we get a force sensor, we attach a skull cap to someone, and then we pull as hard as they can. They have to keep their head in neutral and not let it break. And we see how much force they can sustain through their neck, because neck injuries are really common in golf. And depending on that number, maybe depends on the risk of getting a neck injury. And we don't know that yet. We've got to do the research to find out. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But if a certain force is associated with an increase or decrease in injury risk at the neck, I would argue that that is a useful screening test, because we've screened in or out a risk of neck injury based on a force value that's kind of scientific and robust around the neck, which is a common injury site for golfers. You don't have the research for me to say that's good or bad at the moment, but the point is you kind of come up with that idea, you test that idea, you validate the test, make sure the test works. You check that the reliability of the test is solid. You then take it out to prospective studies. So you track people's neck strength using the test against their injury risk over a year or two. You then publish it and find out, did it make a difference or not? Did it predict injury or not? And then you implement it. So you need to be looking for those sorts of things. Again, not exclusively. There are lots of caveats to this, lots of individual differences, lots of certain movement tests I might use from time to time, depending on the player. But it's just something to think about. Going back to that hip example actually earlier about the hip turn. So if I was working with that guy who was doing his PGA course, he's 100 kilos, he couldn't turn, and I thought maybe it was a hip, first thing I'd do is check the hip range of movement. That's technically a movement assessment or screen test. But from that, I could tell them, what they needed to work on or what they needed to do. So there's kind of that caveat there. So very last question, just because I thought it was an important one that I saw pop up, which is, would you adapt anything for teenagers, so 16 plus? So basically, I'd say you've got beginners, intermediates, and advanced people in the gym. And whether they're 12, 20, or 40, or 60, I'm going to treat them broadly in a similar way according to their goals, of course. There's no reason why a young person can't lift as heavy as they want to lift, from a kind of safety and research perspective, as long as they're coached well, they've got good technique, they know how to use the gym, they're confident, they're safe, and all of that good stuff, which is no different to, if I was working with a 20-year-old, a 25-year-old, a 40-year-old, a 60-year-old. If they're safe, they're confident, they're moving well, they've been coached well, and all of those good things, they're going to lift more weight than if they're still developing those skills. So there's any kind of myths, so any stuff that you hear around young people can't lift weights because it's going to negatively affect their growth plates, or all that kind of nonsense, is 100% not supported by the literature. And they can do basically whatever they want with all those caveats. They've had good coaching, they know what they're doing, they know their way around the gym, they know how to execute the movement safely, and they're built up to a certain weight or a certain exercise. So broadly speaking, again, generalization, I would treat young people the same in terms of the training and stimulus as an adult, but rank it by their ability levels and their competence as opposed to their age, and really just kind of go from there, I guess. So that's everything. I'm going to wrap up there. I've had the recording going, so I will try and get that sourced over the next couple of days and share this out to you guys. Thank you very much for everyone who's joined, and also the 50 people that managed to deal with me rambling on through questions for like 45 or however many minutes. So yeah, thank you everybody, and maybe catch up another time. Feel free to message me if you want to catch up, if you have any questions. And thank you.